In her will, Queen Victoria demanded to be buried with an item so shocking that her family had to hide it to avoid causing a scandal. Today, our image of Victoria is of a stout, grumpy old woman. But behind closed doors, her life was a lot more complicated. In her youth, she was basically a prisoner. In later life, she'd be hounded by shocking rumors about her bedroom activities. Queen Victoria was born in 1819, and she was the daughter of Prince Edward, who was the younger son of King George III. She was fifth in line to the throne, so she never would have become queen if her family wasn't full of secrets and heartbreak. Victoria's uncle, King George IV, was really good at fathering illegitimate children, but they couldn't inherit the crown. His only legitimate daughter died young, and his wife refused to have anything more to do with him. So that was a dead end. Her uncle Frederick had no children, and his wife also hated him. Another dead end. Her third uncle, King William IV, had 2 daughters, but they died in infancy. Dead end. No pun intended, that's actually really sad. Her father died before she was a year old, and her grandfather George III died a week after him. Victoria's childhood was, in her own words, rather melancholy. That's because of the insanely controlling way her mother raised her. Victoria's mom, the Duchess of Kent, realized that her daughter would likely become queen, and she wanted that power for herself. So she created what she called the Kensington system. The idea was to keep Victoria so isolated that she'd be completely dependent and form no opinions of her own. From the time she was a small child, Victoria was never allowed to be unsupervised. She was always in the presence of her mother or one of her mother's lackeys. Victoria wasn't allowed to meet or play with other kids, apart from her half-sister and the daughter of her mother's assistant. She was almost never allowed to leave Kensington Palace. Weirdest of all, Victoria was forced to sleep in the same room as her mother until she was 18. Honestly, imagine you're a teenager living in a gigantic palace with like 100 bedrooms, and you're sharing a bunk bed with your mom. That was her life until she turned 18. Then everything suddenly changed. On June 20th, 1837, Victoria was woken from her bed and informed that her uncle, King William IV, was dead. She was now queen. That's a hell of a way to wake up if you ask me. The first thing Victoria did was demand something she never had in her entire life: an hour alone. Seriously, her mother was so controlling she literally never spent 1 hour by herself. The second thing she did was order for her bed to be removed from her mother's room. Shortly after becoming queen, Victoria moved into Buckingham Palace, becoming the first British monarch to live there. Victoria was actually the first person to do a lot of things. In 1839, she became the first queen to propose to her future husband. Even in the 21st century, men almost always proposed to women. But Victoria had no choice. Tradition dictated that no one could propose to a reigning monarch, so she had to pop the question herself. The man that Victoria chose was... Hold on, am I reading that right? Yeah, no. The man Victoria chose was her first cousin, Prince Albert. Surprisingly, Victoria actually married him for love. On their wedding night, she wrote in her diary, "I never spent such an evening. My dearest, dear Albert. His excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before." There's actually a scandalous myth about Victoria's husband that I think we have to mention. Prince Albert is the name given to a piercing in a certain part of male anatomy, and the legend is that the real Prince Albert had one. This may be true to some extent. In Albert's time, the fashion was for men to wear very tight pants. Albert may have used a metal hoop and chain to keep his parts from being too visible. Marrying Albert had an extra special benefit for Victoria. In those days, even royal women were expected to live with their parents until married. Once she had a husband, Victoria could officially free herself from her mother, and that's exactly what she did, evicting the Duchess from the palace and refusing to see her for years. In today's day and age, it's tradition for a bride to wear white, but this wasn't always the case. In fact, Queen Victoria was the one who started the trend. Before Victoria, wedding dresses were often colorful, but the Queen thought hers looked best in white. so that's what she went with. She also decreed that none of her guests could show her up by wearing white themselves. Another social law that has stood the test of time. Since people were so keen to copy her, Victoria ordered the design of her wedding dress to be destroyed, so that no one else could ever use it. A lot of our timeless traditions actually date back to the Victorian era. For example, Christmas trees were not common in the English world until Victorian Albert made them popular. In 1848, a picture of the royal couple decorating a tree was published. As with many other things, the public began to copy their ruler. Victoria and Albert had 9 children. They would later go on to marry into many other European monarchies, producing the Queen's 42 grandchildren. This led to Victoria becoming known as the Grandmother of Europe. To this day, her descendants rule over 7 countries. Although being a descendant of Victoria was an honor, it came with a huge risk. Queen Victoria was the first in her family to carry hemophilia B, which is a rare genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. This leads to easy bruising and prolonged bleeding from wounds. Even a minor cut could be fatal for a hemophiliac. The Queen herself didn't suffer from this disorder, but she passed it down to 3 of her 9 children. From there, it spread to many other members of the royal and noble families across Europe. The disease killed several of her descendants, including her son Leopold, who died at the age of 30 after he slipped and fell. 2 of Queen Victoria's grandsons also bled to death due to hemophilia. The Victorian era was a time of technological advancement, so it made sense that in 1842, Victoria became the first monarch to ride a train. She was also the first British monarch to have electric lights and use the telephone, although she actually hated the latter. She preferred speaking face-to-face, finding phone conversations cold and impersonal. Victoria also hated smoking, which was a lot more common than it is today. She forbade anyone to smoke in her presence and had no smoking signs installed in her palaces, another thing she probably invented. Despite being popular through most of her reign, a surprising number of people tried to kill Victoria. In 1840, 18-year-old Edward Oxford fired at the Queen's carriage. Oxford was accused of high treason for his crime, but ultimately he was found not guilty by reasons of insanity. 2 men tried to shoot Victoria in 1842. John Francis tried to assassinate her 2 days in a row before getting caught. And then only 5 months later, John William Bean made another attempt. However, his gun failed to fire. In 1849, the Queen's carriage was attacked by William Hamilton. A year later, a former soldier got close enough to beat Victoria over the head with an iron cane, giving her a huge bruise on the right side of her head and a black eye. Then in 1872, Arthur O'Connor hopped the fence at Buckingham Palace and approached Victoria's carriage. He pointed his pistol just a foot away from her face before an assistant tackled him to the ground. On another occasion, an assailant fired on Victoria as she left a train station. A group of schoolboys had to beat the attacker into submission with their umbrellas. Victoria survived all of these attempts, but she lost the person dearest to her when she was only 42 years old. Just before Christmas, 1861, Prince Albert died of typhoid fever. The pair had been married for 20 years. Her husband's death provoked a shocking change in Victoria. She was basically in mourning for the rest of her life, which would last another 40 years. She never again wore any color but black, and she kept all Albert's rooms exactly as they had been when he was alive. This went to the extent of having hot water delivered to his empty bedroom every morning and changing the bedsheets daily. More devastatingly, Victoria withdrew from the public life for 10 years. She spent most of her time alone at remote residences. She began overeating due to her grief and gained an unhealthy amount of weight. This is the origin of our modern image of Victoria as a plump, sour-looking old woman. The Queen's retreat from society caused her to become hugely unpopular. Some even began to talk of overthrowing the monarchy. During this time, Victoria also provoked a serious sex scandal. After Albert's death, she grew suspiciously close to one of her servants, a man named John Brown. Brown had been a long-time employee, but he increasingly became the Queen's closest confidant. Victoria lavished him with gifts and created 2 special medals in his honor. She commissioned an official portrait of Brown and also drew sketches of him herself. This led to predictably nasty rumors. Many in society began calling Victoria Mrs. Brown. Politicians and members of the royal family hated Brown and disapproved of Victoria associating with someone so lower class. There's no proof that John and Victoria were ever lovers, but when he died in 1883, she compared the loss to the death of Prince Albert. And when Victoria herself died, she insisted on being buried with an item of Brown's that shocked and disgusted her family. After John Brown, Victoria found another male friend who outraged society even more. In 1887, the Queen was gifted an Indian servant named Muhammad Abdul Karim. She made it clear that she didn't own him and he was free to leave, but Karim decided to stick around. It was a smart choice. Victoria quickly became fond of him and rapidly promoted him. She was interested in India and learned to speak some Hindustani from him. But as with John Brown, her relationship with Karim was bizarrely personal for the time. Victoria moved Karim into the rooms previously occupied by John Brown and took to spending time alone with him. She called him the Munshi, meaning roughly teacher. Unlike John Brown, Karim clearly took advantage of Victoria. He pressed her for promotions, money, and honors, and she obliged him. She purchased an estate for him in India and made him a rich man. On one occasion, Karim's brother Ali stole some of Victoria's jewelry and sold it. When the Queen found out, she accepted the excuse that Ali had simply found it, the finder's keeper's defense. Karim was hated by the Queen's family as well as other servants, both because he used his position to enrich himself and because he was Indian. When Victoria died in 1901, at the age of 81, all of Karim's correspondence with her was burned. He and his family were deported back to India. Despite the rumors, it seemed unlikely that Karim was Victoria's lover. John Brown is another story, though. In her will, Victoria left instructions that she be buried with personal effects belonging to Prince Albert and other people she loved. Specifically, she ordered that a lock of John Brown's hair and a picture of him be placed in her left hand. Her family did as requested, but hid John Brown's mementos in the casket with a large bouquet of flowers. Well, that's it for today's video. What'd you think of Queen Victoria's life? Let us know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more of our content, throw us a like. And subscribe to History Snob for more. Thanks so much for watching.